Hey there! Tonight, we're slipping into a quieter world, not of battles or heroes, but of soft footsteps, silent ferries, and the gentle mysteries of what the ancient Greeks believed waited beyond the last breath, instead of fields and huts and daily struggles. Imagine lantern-lit paths, slow-moving rivers, and the steady rhythm of a realm that never rushed. If this kind of soft, winding storytelling helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you rest. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's oddly soothing to see people across the world settling into the same quiet story. So get comfortable, dim the lights, let the room fall still, and together we'll take a slow, thoughtful walk through the ancient Greek afterlife, step by gentle step. Tonight, we begin our quiet journey into a world the ancient Greeks knew intimately, one they discussed around hearthfires, etched onto pottery, and whispered about during long walks home after dusk. Death, to them, wasn't a sudden plunge into darkness, nor a grand cinematic moment. It was simply a transition, a gentle releasing, as though life itself were an old cloak being shrugged from the shoulders. The Greeks had many opinions about death, sometimes contradictory, sometimes poetic, always imaginative. But the idea that the soul survived the body was more or less accepted from the earliest days. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, written around the 8th century BCE, we find some of the earliest descriptions. There, the soul, psyche, is something like a soft breath that drifts away once the body falls silent. Not dramatic, not frightening, just a faint exhale, as though the world is sighing you onward. To the ordinary villager, death was neither a philosophical puzzle nor a theological battlefield. It was part of the natural cycle. One moment you lay upon the woven blankets of your bed, your family gathered around. The next, your soul stood beside your body, blinking in mild confusion, as souls tend to do in stories. There was no thunderclap, no booming cosmic announcement, no divine secretary calling out your name. Simply the awareness, gentle and inevitable, that you were no longer tied to the weight of flesh. And in a comforting twist, you weren't left to wander alone. Before the soul ever took its first steps into the other world, the living had their role to play. The Greeks were very particular about funerary rites, not because they enjoyed procedure, though admittedly they did enjoy a good festival, but because the soul needed help getting where it belonged. As soon as someone died, the family washed the body, anointed it with fragrant oils, and dressed it in clean garments. The women of the household would sing laments, songs of grief, remembrance, and perhaps a touch of theatrical flair, depending on the household. Sometimes professional mourners joined in, adding volume and dramatic effect. The body was then laid out for the prophesis, a period of viewing and farewells. Archaeologists know these practices not only from texts, but from pottery, particularly the vases of the archaic period, which often show mourners flanking the bier, hands raised in ritual sorrow. Beneath all the emotion and ceremony was a practical belief. If the proper rites weren't followed, the soul might become restless. Homer hints at this when the soul of Patroclus appears to Achilles in a dream, begging for burial so he may enter the underworld. Even heroes, it seems, needed proper paperwork. This tells us something revealing. The Greeks believed death involved community. The living helped the dead, not with prayers of salvation, but with the simple dignity of guiding them toward their next destination. But eventually, even the most devoted family must step aside. What followed belonged to the soul alone. In most Greek stories, the moment of death involves a gentle separation. The soul rises lightly from the body, often imagined as a faint silhouette or a shimmering duplicate, something like the way heat ripples above stone in the summer. The soul isn't terrified, it isn't confused. It simply becomes aware that life has shifted into something new. The Greeks found comfort in this idea. Life was unpredictable. Storms sank ships, wars erupted with admirable enthusiasm, and relatives meddled in your life choices with gusto. But death followed a system. It was reliable, predictable, in its own way, even gentle. And the first rule of this system was simple. You don't travel alone. Just outside the reach of the living world stood Hermes Psychopompos. Not Hermes the trickster, nor Hermes the messenger, nor Hermes the inventor of deceptive sandals. No, this was Hermes in his calmest form. Patient, quiet, compassionate. Ancient art often shows him standing beside the deceased, holding his staff, the Kerykeion, with an expression of serene duty. He'd performed this task thousands of times. If the gods had a seniority system, Hermes surely had tenure. When the soul rose from the body, Hermes greeted it without ceremony, without lecture, and certainly without judgment. He simply offered his company. The Greeks liked this idea immensely. At the most vulnerable moment of existence, they imagined a familiar god escorting them onward. A steady presence, not forcing or dragging, but guiding. Vase paintings from the classical period show Hermes leaning in slightly, as if encouraging the soul with a nod that said, "Right then, this way." The first steps beyond the mortal world were not dramatic. The Greeks pictured the boundaries between worlds as liminal spaces, coastal caves with cool air, deep ravines that swallowed sound, or remote groves where the wind seemed quieter. These weren't monstrous landscapes. They were simply places on the edge of human experience. The region of Epirus, for example, housed the Necromanteon, a sanctuary where visitors sought communication with the dead. The rituals there involved dark corridors and echoing chambers meant to mimic the descent into Hades. It wasn't an actual death journey, of course, but it shows how the Greeks imagined that transition. Dimness, stillness, and the sense of stepping somewhere the living rarely went. As the soul followed Hermes, it sometimes retained its personality, at least briefly. In the Odyssey, Odysseus meets shades who remember him, speak to him, even criticize him. Achilles famously tells Odysseus that he'd rather be a living farmhand than a king among the dead. This wasn't meant to frighten listeners, but to remind them that life, imperfect and unpredictable, was still worth cherishing. Even so, the moment of separation for the newly dead was imagined as calm, a release from the body's burdens, a quiet return to the natural order. What strikes modern readers is how little fear surrounds this moment. For the Greeks, death was not a punishment nor a moral battleground. It was simply the other side of life, a shift, a movement, an exhale. Even philosophers like Socrates approached it with almost cheerful curiosity. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates suggests death is either a dreamless sleep or a journey to meet others who have died. To him, both options sounded rather pleasant, particularly the second, as he anticipated interesting conversations. At some point along the journey, the soul looked back. Not dramatically, not with longing or regret, but with a simple acknowledgement that the life behind them had been lived. The Greeks didn't imagine souls clinging desperately to the world. The dead accepted their path. They knew the living would continue their duties, tending graves, pouring libations, remembering them during festivals such as the Antisteria, when the spirits of the deceased were briefly believed to wander the city. And so the soul turned away again, ready to follow Hermes deeper into the borderlands. Ahead lay rivers, judges, meadows, and perhaps even paradise or punishment, depending on which poet you listen to. But none of that arrives yet. For now, there is only the quiet step forward, the gentle escort of a god who has walked this path since the dawn of time. The beginning of a journey every ancient Greek expected to make eventually. Tonight we remain at this threshold, the moment between breaths, between worlds, between what was and what will be. The Greeks imagined it as calm, orderly, and surprisingly familiar. Not the end, but a beginning of a different sort. And as we drift along the edges of their imagination, we prepare for the next stage of the journey, where Hermes will guide the soul toward the rivers of the dead. If you listen closely to the old Greek stories, really listen, you begin to notice something rather comforting tucked between all the thunderbolts, sea storms, and theatre-worthy family arguments. No soul, no matter how humble or unremarkable, ever had to find its own way into the afterlife. The Greeks, practical people that they were, assumed the cosmos included a sort of spiritual escort service. And at the head of this gentle operation stood Hermes Psychopompos, Hermes the guide of souls. Now, Hermes is a busy figure in Greek mythology. He appears in so many stories that one suspects he kept an extremely well-used day planner. He invented the lyre, delivered messages for Zeus, stole Apollo's cattle, on day one of his life no less, guided heroes, protected travellers, and occasionally caused mischief simply for the entertainment value. But the role that mattered most at the quiet edge of life was the one he performed with the greatest softness, leading the dead where they were meant to go. To imagine Hermes Psychopompos, picture a god walking with the grace of someone who has trodden the same path countless times and has never once tripped. He arrives precisely when he's needed, not early, not late, and certainly never in dramatic fashion. Hermes does not sweep in with fiery wings or echoing proclamations. He simply appears beside the newly departed, like a polite official who has come to walk you to your appointment. The Greeks adored this idea. At the most vulnerable moment of existence, the soul is greeted not by a terrifying judge, nor a chasm of fire, but by a familiar god with a calm expression and good manners. Hermes, in this form, is less a trickster and more a guardian. He holds his kerykeion, the herald's staff, not as a weapon, but as a symbol that no harm can reach you while he is near. In vase paintings, he often leans forward slightly, a subtle gesture of guidance, as though saying, "Right then, let's be off." There is something deeply human about this depiction. The Greeks understood anxiety. They understood the uncertainty that surrounds death, and so they imagined a god who embodies reassurance. Hermes does not demand worship here. He does not ask for sacrifices. He simply stands beside you with the quiet competence of someone who has walked 1 billion souls along this road and considers it nothing less than his sacred duty. Artists from the archaic and classical periods painted Hermes with soft lines in this role, depicting him in calm poses that contrast sharply with the dramatic scenes he appears in elsewhere. On some funerary stele, he places a hand gently on a mourner's shoulder, or gestures for the soul to follow. Scholars often remark on his expression in these works, slightly solemn, slightly serene, as though he understands both the grief of the living and the uncertainty of the newly dead. Of course, Hermes did not perform this role alone. The soul itself had a part to play. Newly freed from the body, it would stand briefly in the world of the living, watching the final gestures of those left behind. But eventually the moment came. Hermes would tilt his head toward the path, leading away from life, and the soul, trusting him completely, would follow. This path wasn't chaotic or frightening in early Greek imagination. There were no swirling portals or enormous creatures leaping from the shadows. Instead, the journey began in the gentlest possible way. A walk. A walk through landscapes both earthly and unearthly, through liminal places the Greeks associated with thresholds, caves where light shifted strangely, groves where the air grew unusually still, or rocky coastlines where the world seemed to pause. Hermes, ever patient, moved at whatever pace the soul required. Rushing was not part of the afterlife's design. Ancient travellers must have taken comfort in the idea that a god walked this route with them. The world beyond life was vast, mysterious, and full of places one did not want to wander into accidentally. Hermes ensured against such mishaps. If the newly dead could become distracted by some curious sound or an interesting rock formation, something entirely plausible in Greek mythology, Hermes would simply redirect them with the mildest gesture. He was the epitome of polite firmness. The Greeks saw Hermes' guidance as a cosmic kindness. Death was universal, but it didn't have to be lonely. And this companionship was more than symbolic. It shaped how the Greeks approached their funerals, their stories, and even their philosophy. The soul wasn't flung into oblivion. It wasn't expected to bravely march into uncertainty alone. Instead, it was gently escorted, as if the universe itself recognized the significance of its transition. This role of Hermes also reveals something important about Greek religion. The gods were involved in human life not just through thunderous interventions, but through quiet, everyday moments. Hermes guiding a shepherd's soul was just as meaningful as Hermes delivering a message for Zeus. To the Greeks, divinity was not distant or aloof. It walked with them, quite literally, to the end. Over time, poets and philosophers added new layers to the idea. Some imagined Hermes carrying a lantern. Others said he spoke softly to the newly dead, explaining what lay ahead. Later authors, especially those influenced by Orphic mystery traditions, suggested that Hermes offered souls hints or advice about the rivers they would soon encounter, though, naturally, no surviving text clarifies whether he discouraged drinking from Lethe too early. One imagines him saying, "Now, best to wait for instructions before sipping anything around here." In some stories, Hermes escorted heroes into the underworld while they were still alive, acting as a kind of supernatural tour guide. When Psyche descended to retrieve a box from Persephone, Hermes was said to help her return safely. When Orpheus travelled to retrieve Eurydice, Hermes played a role again, escorting Eurydice back toward the living world until Orpheus, in a moment of passionate impatience, broke the only rule. And when the soul of Sisyphus attempted to sneak back to the surface through clever trickery, Hermes was the one sent to fetch him. Even in the afterlife, the gods apparently had one person responsible for dealing with nonsense. Because Hermes handled so many transitions, beginnings, journeys, boundaries, the Greeks naturally associated him with all forms of passage. Doorways, crossroads, travel, commerce, negotiation, diplomacy, and, finally, death. The psychopomp role was simply one part of a larger theme. Hermes helped mortals move from one state of being to another, and he did so without judgment. That responsibility fell to the three judges deeper within Hades. Hermes merely ensured everyone arrived safely for their appointments. This gentle neutrality is perhaps why the Greeks trusted him with their final moment. Hermes was not vindictive. He was not overly stern. He didn't punish or reward. He simply guided. Even those who had lived tumultuous lives received the same escort as kings, poets, or warriors. Hermes' presence levelled all distinctions. In death, every soul was a traveller, and Hermes the eternal companion. As the journey continued, the landscape gradually shifted. The world of the living faded behind the soul, like a distant shoreline. Ahead, shadows deepened. Mists thickened. And somewhere faintly came the sound of flowing water, the first hint of the rivers that defined the boundary of the underworld. Hermes did not rush. He simply matched his pace to the soul's, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows every stone on the path. And so the soul moved forward, not in fear, but in quiet acceptance. The Greeks imagined it as a peaceful procession, a god and a traveller walking side by side, leaving behind the noise of life for the soft hush of eternity. Soon enough, the river would appear, Styx, Acheron, Lethe, and others, each carrying its own meaning and its own mystery. But those lie ahead. For now, the journey continues under the watchful, calm guidance of Hermes Psychopompos, the companion every Greek trusted to lead them safely into the world beyond. The journey toward the Greek underworld was never imagined as a sudden drop or a dramatic swoop into darkness. No trapdoors, no plunging chasms, no swirling vortices designed to make one dizzy. Instead, the Greeks pictured a walk, a long, quiet walk, one that unfolded across the edges of the world, a walk that any traveller of the ancient countryside might recognise, if not for the soft thinning of reality around them, and the increasingly watchful presence of Hermes at their side. For the newly dead, this journey began where the world of the living loosened its grip. The Greeks believed that certain places, caves, ravines, dense groves, misty marshes, were not fully within the domain of mortals. They were cracks along the border of existence, margins, places where the air behaved differently and sound seemed to carry on a bit longer than expected, as though listening for something. It made perfect sense to them that the soul's first steps toward Hades would lead through such landscapes. After all, if you were going to move from one world to another, why not start somewhere that was already halfway between? To the average Greek villager or shepherd, these places were familiar. They grazed goats along rocky slopes where the wind whistled through narrow gaps. They passed by grottos with cool air drifting outward. They travelled footpaths that dipped into sudden pockets of stillness. Even in daylight, such places felt touched by something beyond human life. Not frightening, exactly, just attentive. Therefore, when poets like Homer or Hesiod described the soul following Hermes into the beyond, their listeners already had a landscape in mind. They'd seen the world's edges with their own eyes. The ancient Greeks even identified specific entrances to the underworld, a fact that modern tourists would probably find either thrilling or deeply concerning, depending on their constitution. One famous entry point was at Cape Taenarum, on the southern tip of the Peloponnese. There, a cave opened to the sea, and for centuries Greeks believed it to be one of the actual gates to Hades. Heroes supposedly passed through its shadowed threshold, which is a charming thought until you realise that Odysseus and Heracles both used it for journeys that went less than smoothly. Still, the cave existed, people visited it, offerings were left, and the idea persisted. Somewhere in that dim, echoing passage, the boundary between worlds thinned. But even before reaching such mythic locations, the newly dead travelled through gentler borderlands. Imagine walking through a grove where the sunlight seems pale, not because it's dawn or dusk, but because the world itself feels momentarily tired. Or crossing a ravine where the shadows deepen in a way that suggests they're paying attention. The Greeks understood these subtle sensations intimately. Their stories grew from the land they lived on, the places where mystery clung to stone and soil. The journey to Hades was not a plunge into fantasy. It was a continuation of the landscapes they already knew. Hermes, of course, was perfectly comfortable in such areas. As a god associated with boundaries and transitions, doorways, crossroads, travellers, messages delivered between worlds, he understood liminal spaces better than anyone. The Romans, enamoured with categorising everything, later described him in similar terms as Mercury, the god who could move where others could not. But the Greeks had no need for such classification. Hermes simply was. He belonged wherever the world shifted from one thing to another. One can imagine him walking a few steps ahead of the soul, staff in hand, pacing himself with the ease of someone strolling through a garden. If the soul hesitated, he slowed. If the soul wandered, perhaps curious about a strange rustling in the bushes, as souls sometimes are in myths, Hermes gently redirected them without annoyance. He'd seen it all before. Some souls were philosophical and contemplative. Others were surprised. A few, no doubt, were still trying to process the situation. Hermes had patience for all of them. Eternity, after all, is long enough not to rush. Now, one might wonder whether the Greeks actually believed in this literal walk. The answer, as usual, sits somewhere between yes and a thoughtful shrug. Greek religion was never doctrinaire in the modern sense. Myths existed alongside local customs, philosophical speculation, folk beliefs, regional variations, and a general willingness to accept multiple interpretations simultaneously. For some, the journey was symbolic, a representation of the soul's passage from life into memory. For others, it was quite literal. And many, one suspects, simply liked the idea of a nice, orderly transition. The important part wasn't the physical geography, but the cosmic certainty of moving from one state to another. The long walk gave structure to an experience that otherwise might feel chaotic. But the poets did enjoy giving that structure detail. Homer described the underworld as lying far beneath the earth, reached by roads that even the gods rarely travelled. Later, writers expanded this into more elaborate versions, adding rivers, gates, guardians, and vast plains. The journey to reach these places became longer, more atmospheric, more symbolic. The Greeks never let a good story go underdeveloped. Interestingly, archaeological evidence hints at how deeply these ideas permeated daily life. Grave goods found throughout the Greek world, coins for Charon, small vases, carved figurines, suggest that people prepared themselves for a journey. The dead were equipped as travellers. Even their burial positions sometimes reflect movement, bodies oriented east to west, as if anticipating a rising or setting. And inscriptions on funerary stelae often speak of calm passage, peaceful rest, and being led by the god. That god, of course, was Hermes. Even philosophers, who often complicated simple ideas for sport, accepted the concept of a transition after death. Plato described the earth as a sphere with hollow regions beneath it, filled with rivers and streams. Souls wandered these terrains according to their moral character, eventually finding rest. Though his version included moral sorting, he still maintained the idea of movement, of journeying through landscapes shaped by both physical and ethical truths. Meanwhile, the Orphic tradition offered another perspective, imagining the soul as a traveller seeking spiritual purification. Their gold tablets, buried with the dead, include instructions for the soul's journey, which springs to drink from, which paths to avoid, and what to say to the guardians encountered along the way. It is, essentially, the universe's earliest printed travel guide. For the common soul walking beside Hermes, however, things were simpler. The long path stretched quietly ahead. No monsters lurked in the brush. No tests occurred on the roadside. The world simply grew dimmer, softer. The sound of mortal life faded. Distant waves no longer quite reached the ear. Birdsong weakened. The wind quieted until it became something more like memory than sensation. Hermes walked with steady confidence, the one fixed point in a landscape designed to ease the soul gradually into a new reality. And then, at some moment the soul could not precisely mark, because time itself began to lose its edges. The scenery shifted. The familiar topography of the living world gave way to terrain that felt older, deeper, and somehow listening. The Greeks did not imagine the boundary between worlds as a sharp line, but as a gradual thickening of shadow and thinning of sound. The world became less interested in being a world, and more interested in becoming something else. Ahead lay the rivers, the ferrymen, the gates of Hades. But none of that belonged to the long walk itself. The purpose of the journey was to prepare, to ease the soul, gently and without hurry, from the realm of the known into the realm of the eternal. Hermes, ever patient, never broke the silence unless necessary. Perhaps he offered a nod now and then, or a small reassuring glance, but mostly he let the journey speak for itself. And the Greeks believed the soul, guided by such company, began to understand something essential. Life did not end in a cliff or a void. It unfolded into the next chapter with the same rhythm it followed on earth. A rhythm of walking, breathing, noticing, and above all, continuing. By the time the soul reached the rivers of the underworld, the world of the living had thinned into something more like a distant rumour. Hermes still walked at the traveller's side, but even he seemed quieter now, as though there was something sacred about this particular threshold. For the Greeks, rivers had always been more than water. They marked boundaries. They divided cities, lands, and even stories. A river could be crossed, respected, feared, or worshipped, but it could never be ignored. And so it makes perfect sense that the entrance to Hades was shaped not by a single river, but by several, each with its own character, history, and personality. The first most souls encountered was the Acheron, often called the River of Pain. Now this name sounds dreadfully dramatic, but the Greeks were not imagining a torrent of horrors. Pain, in this context, was more about sorrow, about the quiet ache of leaving the world behind. The Acheron embodied the emotional weight of transition. Even in local Greek geography, the Acheron was a real river in Epirus, flowing through a valley of unusual beauty. Ancient travellers visited it not to be terrified, but to perform rituals, consult oracles, and reflect on mortality. It is hard to imagine a landscape less suited to melodrama, but myths often take what is familiar and turn it symbolic. The Acheron became the first great divider, the point one could no longer step back across as easily as one had stepped forward. Across its surface, the soul would see a mist rising like pale breath. It wasn't meant to frighten. It was simply the river's way of reminding the traveller that they were entering a place where ordinary rules no longer applied. Some poets imagined whispers rising from the current, echoes of past lives, not malicious but contemplative. The soul did not fear the Acheron. It understood that every meaningful journey had a moment like this, a place where one paused and realised there was no need to hurry, because eternity was now the context. But while the Acheron symbolised sorrow, the next river, the Styx, carried a far heavier reputation. If Greek rivers were characterised the way people describe relatives at family gatherings, the Styx would be the formidable aunt whose opinion everyone respected whether they wanted to or not. The Styx was the river by which the gods swore their most binding oaths. Zeus himself would not break a promise sworn upon its waters. To violate such an oath meant a year of unconsciousness, followed by 9 years of exile from the divine community. The Greeks did not take the Styx lightly. In myth, the Styx is often described as cold, dark, and impossibly deep. Water that does not simply flow, but seems to guard something ancient. It is not surprising that it became associated with the sanctity of promises, the unyielding truth the cosmos demanded. When the soul approached the Styx, it wasn't asked to swear anything. The river simply observed. The presence of the Styx reminded the traveller that death had its own seriousness, its own dignity, its own laws. Nothing in the underworld was arbitrary. Everything had meaning. Yet the soul was not expected to cross the Styx on its own. That task belonged to Charon, the ferryman, who we shall meet soon. For now, the soul merely watched the dark water glide beneath a mist that carried a silence so complete it felt almost comforting. A river that kept divine oaths was not one to fear. It was one to respect. And respect, in Greek thought, was a very peaceful emotion. Beyond the Styx lay the Lethe, a river much softer in temperament. While the Styx demanded seriousness, the Lethe invited forgetfulness. Forgetting, in Greek imagination, was not a curse but a release. Life came with burdens. Griefs, regrets, obligations, unfinished quarrels, and the occasional embarrassing moment one desperately wished could be erased. The Lethe promised a clean slate. To drink from it meant letting go of the sharp edges of life. This was especially important for souls destined for reincarnation in certain philosophical traditions. For example, in Plato's myth of air, souls preparing for new lives drank from the Lethe before returning to the world, lest they carried too much memory with them. But this forgetfulness was gentle rather than absolute. The Greeks did not imagine the soul becoming empty or hollow. It retained its essence, its character. It simply let go of the weight of earthly sorrow. A sip from Lethe was not a loss. It was a kindness. In contrast, Orphic traditions speak of another spring, Mnemosyne, the fountain of memory. Followers of this cult sought to avoid Lethe entirely, aiming instead to remember their divine origins. They carried small gold tablets with instructions for the afterlife, like a celestial passport. These tablets told the soul exactly what to say when confronted by guardians. I am a child of earth and starry heaven. This declaration granted access to Mnemosyne's waters, allowing the soul to preserve its identity across incarnations. The idea that one could choose between forgetting and remembering gives the Greek afterlife a strangely personal touch. Even in death, there were decisions to make. Further into Hades flowed other rivers, lesser known but equally symbolic. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, murmured with echoes of old griefs. Griefs not sharp or punishing, but softened by time. It was as though the regrets of countless lives had been placed in a gentle stream, allowed to dissolve into memory. Then there was the Phlegethon, a river of fire, not the roaring inferno one might expect, but a slow-burning, glowing current that symbolized passion, purification, and divine wrath. Even this fiery river was not necessarily frightening. The Greeks did not imagine the underworld as a place of endless torture. Fire, like water, had its place in the cosmic order. Together, these rivers acted as both boundaries and guides. They oriented the soul, marking the transition from one phase of existence to the next. And though each river carried its own symbolism, pain, oath, forgetfulness, lamentation, fire, none existed to torment the dead. They were part of a landscape that held immense meaning, a geography shaped as much by poetry as by law. Hermes escorted the soul between these rivers with quiet understanding, allowing it time to take in each one. He did not explain their meanings unless the soul seemed particularly confused, and even then he probably offered a simple summary rather than a lecture. Gods, after all, have a great deal of experience with travellers asking complicated metaphysical questions at inconvenient moments. A mild gesture, a patient glance, perhaps a soft clearing of the throat. That was usually enough to guide the soul forward. And somewhere between these rivers, the soul began to sense something subtle yet profound. The underworld was not a place of chaos. It was orderly, structured, ancient. It had its rituals, its geography, its rhythms. The rivers were not obstacles but signposts, each one helping the soul understand where it was, where it had come from, and where it was going next. Ahead lay the ferryman, waiting by his boat on the Acheron, or the Styx depending on the tradition. But that meeting belonged to the next part of the journey. For now, the soul simply stood among the rivers, breathing, or whatever passes for breathing in such realms, the timeless air of Hades. The waters moved softly. Hermes stood patiently. And the soul understood, perhaps for the first time, that it had truly crossed the boundary between life and eternity. By the time the soul reached the riverbank, where Charon kept his small but dependable ferry, the journey had already begun to feel timeless. Hermes, ever patient, remained just a step away, but there was a quiet sense now that another figure would soon take over the task of guiding. The air around the river, whether the Acheron or the Styx, depending on which poet one asked, held a solemn stillness, not unpleasant, not threatening, just still, as though the world itself was waiting politely for the next step to unfold. Charon, the ferryman of the dead, was not a frightening figure in the earliest Greek imagination. He was certainly not a skeletal spectre or a hooded phantom. Those were embellishments from later, more theatrically inclined centuries. To the ancient Greeks, Charon was simply a worker, a man, or something like a man, who performed a necessary repetitive task with calm professionalism. His boat was not ornate. His clothing was not dramatic. He existed for one purpose: to ferry souls across the river that marked the boundary of Hades. In vase paintings and carvings, Charon appears rugged, sometimes elderly, sometimes weathered, always practical. One can imagine him with the air of a boatman who has seen every type of traveller, from the quiet and contemplative to the bewildered and chatty, and has learned to take it all in stride. His silence was not ominous. It was simply the silence of someone who had a job to do, and preferred to do it without unnecessary fuss. The Greeks respected this. They liked the idea of a ferryman who did not interrogate you about your life choices, did not judge your character, did not question your fashion sense, and did not comment on your earthly misadventures. Charon was neutral, efficient, and remarkably unobtrusive. He did, however, expect payment. Even helpful cosmic employees must eat, one supposes. The payment, of course, was the famous obol, the small coin placed in the mouth or upon the eyes of the deceased. Archaeological excavations throughout the Greek world have uncovered such coins, confirming how deeply this belief was woven into funerary practice. Families took great care in ensuring the coin was placed correctly. To forget, it was unthinkable. No one wanted their loved one wandering the riverbank indefinitely, unable to pay the fare. The Greeks believed in hospitality, but even they understood that ferry services did not run on goodwill. Charon accepted the obol without ceremony. No receipts, no arguments over exchange rates. He stored the coins somewhere on the boat in a manner never fully explained by myth. One imagines he had a pouch or a small box tucked under the seat. Or perhaps there was some magical bottomless compartment built into the vessel specifically for the purpose. In any case, the payment was always accepted, and once it was given, Charon gestured for the soul to step aboard. This part of the journey marked the first moment when Hermes stepped back. He did not vanish, nor did he abandon the traveller, but his role shifted. For the duration of the crossing, Karen was in charge. The boat, narrow and slightly worn, floated gently on the dark water. It did not rock or sway unnecessarily. Karen handled it with practiced steadiness, as though even the river itself respected the routine. The Greeks imagined this crossing as solemn, yes, but also calm. The river did not churn. No monstrous tentacles reached from below. No storm clouds gathered overhead. The underworld was not a place that required chaos to assert its authority. Instead, the water mirrored the timeless stillness of Hades itself. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of Charon's pole as he guided the boat forward. There is something soothing about this image, a crossing not of terror but of closure. Some souls, one imagines, took the opportunity to contemplate their journey thus far. Others may have attempted conversation with Charon, only to find him politely unresponsive. A man with infinite crossings to complete likely grew accustomed to silence. Yet one must not mistake his silence for coldness. Charon was not cruel. He simply understood that this portion of the journey was one in which the soul needed no distraction. It was a moment between worlds, a pause before judgment, or rest or wandering. In Greek tragedy, Charon occasionally appeared in a more dramatic role. Playwrights like Aristophanes enjoyed giving him lines, especially comedic ones, because audiences found humour in the idea of a stoic ferryman dealing with troublesome mortals. But in genuine religious imagination, Charon remained steadfast and undramatic. He did not chase after souls or drag them aboard. He did not threaten or punish. He simply waited, accepted the fare, and rode. This understated dignity made him a surprisingly beloved figure in Greek funerary tradition. Families comforted themselves with the thought that their loved ones were not cast into the afterlife alone, or left wandering in confusion. There was a boatman waiting at the riverbank, a dependable, stoic presence whose entire existence was dedicated to making sure souls reached the next stage of their journey. There were, of course, exceptions. In stories where bodies were left unburied or funerary rites were neglected, souls might wander along the river's edge, unable to pay Charon. But even these tales carried a moral more than a metaphysical threat. They reminded the living to respect the dead, to perform the rituals properly, and to acknowledge the responsibilities of community. In daily life, these stories encouraged families to treat funerals with care. Proper rites ensured proper passage. When the boat finally reached the opposite shore, Charon guided it into a gentle stop. The Greeks imagined the far bank as a shadowed, mist-covered terrain, a land neither hostile nor comforting, simply other. The soul stepped off, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, and Charon turned the boat around without ceremony. His task was done. There were countless more souls to ferry. Eternity, after all, is very long, and the ferry schedule must be kept. Some versions of the myth suggest that heroes or exceptional individuals were granted unique crossings. Orpheus, for example, charmed Charon and the entire underworld with his music. Heracles, in one story, forced Charon to take him, which resulted in the ferryman being punished for allowing a living person aboard. But these exceptions proved the rule. The underworld was governed by order, and Charon was part of that order. He upheld the structure, calmly, quietly, and unfailingly. The crossing across the underworld's waters symbolized a final letting go, the last moment in which the soul remained in motion before entering Hades proper. Once the boat touched shore, the soul's path diverged, depending on the traditions one followed. Some souls faced the judges. Some wandered the meadows. Some, according to philosophical schools, sought to cleanse themselves of memory or experience. But all shared one thing: they had crossed under the guidance of Charon, the patient ferryman. As the soul stepped away from the river and into the deeper, more permanent landscape of Hades, Hermes returned beside it, no longer the primary guide, but a quiet companion once more. Charon's ferry drifted back into the mist, already seeking the next traveller. And so the journey continued, not with fear, but with the reassuring knowledge that each stage of the afterlife had its guardians. Some stern, some kind, some simply doing their jobs. Charon was one of the latter, a figure who asked nothing except a single small coin, and repaid it with the safe passage every Greek believed they would one day need. Ahead waited the gates of the underworld, the judges, and the quiet expanse of eternity. But for now, the soul had arrived. It had crossed the river. Once the soul stepped off Charon's ferry and onto the shadowed banks beyond the rivers, it found itself in a world unlike any it had ever known. Not terrifying, not chaotic, just profoundly different. The air felt older somehow, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries and did not intend to start stirring now. Even Hermes, who remained at the soul's side, seemed to tread more carefully. The Greeks believed that the heart of Hades was a place of order, solemnity, and eternal quiet, and the first few steps into it reflected that perfectly. The terrain of the underworld, at least in early Greek imagination, was not fiery or brutal. It was muted, soft-edged, and deeply still. A kind of perpetual twilight lingered everywhere, not quite night, not quite day, but a calm, dim glow that made everything feel suspended in time. Poets described the land as shadowy, but not oppressive, a place where the brightness of life had faded into something gentler, more reflective. One could almost imagine the colours of the world washed with a thin layer of silver dust. Ahead stood the gates of Hades, vast, ancient, and rarely described in detail by Greek authors. This lack of description says something in itself. The Greeks didn't need to imagine towering iron bars or burning thresholds covered in fearsome engravings. The gates were symbolic, a clear demarcation between what was mortal and what was eternal. They were the final boundary, the point from which no soul returned unless it was part of some particularly dramatic myth involving a hero, a grieving spouse, or a god with questionable patience. Guarding these gates was the creature nearly everyone knows, even those who have never opened a book of mythology, Cerberus. But the Cerberus of the Greek imagination was not a ravenous monster snapping at anything that moved. He was a guardian, yes, but one with a very specific job: to prevent the living from entering and the dead from leaving. Those were his only concerns. For souls who belonged in the underworld, Cerberus posed no threat at all. In fact, he hardly noticed them. They passed by him the way travellers pass a dozing dog at a farmhouse gate, cautiously respectful, but mostly untroubled. Cerberus is usually described as having 3 heads, though some ancient authors gave him 50, and a few particularly enthusiastic ones went as high as 100. The Greeks were rarely concerned with precise numbers when telling stories. What mattered was the symbolism. Many believed the 3 heads represented the past, present, and future, or birth, life, and death. Others thought the head simply made him an excellent listener. In any case, he was a creature of order, not chaos, a protector, not a menace. Hermes often gave Cerberus a brief nod as he passed, and Cerberus, by most accounts, allowed the souls to enter without fuss. Only heroes attempting dramatic returns to the world above needed to worry about him, and even then, a handful of stories showed that he could be bribed with honeycakes. This is, one imagines, one of the most relatable details in all of Greek mythology. Even great guardians are willing to negotiate with snacks. Once inside the gates, the soul entered what many Greeks believed was the true realm of Hades, a vast, quiet expanse ruled not by darkness but by stillness. It was not a place of torment or punishment for ordinary people. The Greeks had no concept of eternal agony for the average soul. That was a later invention from other traditions. Instead, Hades was a neutral kingdom, a land where the dead simply existed, freed from the burdens and noise of mortal life. The ruler of this realm, Hades himself, also called Pluton, was not a villainous figure at all. Despite modern portrayals that cast him as a sinister antagonist, the Greeks saw him as dignified, just, and somewhat aloof. He did not torment souls. He did not interfere with the living. He maintained order with calm precision, ensuring that the dead remained in their proper place, and that the natural cycle of life was preserved. To the Greeks, a god who kept the universe functioning smoothly was someone to be respected, not feared. Hades was feared only in the way one fears the inevitability of time. The soul did not meet Hades immediately, nor was it summoned before a terrifying throne. Instead, the first figures encountered were the three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who stood within the entrance hall of the underworld. Their task was to evaluate each soul and determine its eternal place. This was not a dramatic trial. There were no booming accusations or calling of witnesses. The Greeks imagined it as orderly, calm, and fair. Minos, the most famous, presided with the wisdom of a former king who had once been entrusted with the law by Zeus himself. Rhadamanthus, known for his strict but righteous judgment, handled the more straightforward cases. Aeacus, the son of Zeus and legendary founder of Aegina, managed the concerns of those who came from his part of the world. The Greeks loved giving their mythical structures a sense of local administration. Even the afterlife had jurisdictional assignments. When the soul arrived before these judges, it did not tremble with fear. Instead, it offered an account of its life, not every detail, but the essence. The judges, gifted with divine insight, understood the truth of a life as easily as one might observe the surface of a calm pond. There were no tricks, no hidden agendas. The Greeks did not fear judgment as a moral reckoning. They believed the universe simply placed individuals where they naturally belonged. For most souls, those who lived ordinary lives without great virtue or vice, the destination was the fields of asphodel, a quiet, dreamlike meadow that stretched endlessly through the heart of Hades, a resting place of neutrality and calm. Souls here wandered gently, untroubled by earthly drama. Life's ambitions and regrets faded into soft echoes, leaving only the peaceful rhythm of existence. But we are not there yet. The soul, after receiving its judgment, continued deeper into Hades. Along the way it might encounter the faint shimmer of other souls drifting peacefully. Some recognized each other, though dimly, like remembering a face from childhood without recalling the name. Companionship existed in the underworld, but it was subtle, muted, not joyful, not sorrowful, simply present. As the soul walked, it became clear that Hades was not a place designed to frighten. It was designed to maintain balance. The underworld served a cosmic purpose. It ensured that life and death remained in harmony. Without Hades, the world of the living would collapse under the weight of its own perpetuity. Nature required endings, and endings required a keeper. That keeper was Hades. One might wonder why the Greeks imagined such a calm afterlife for ordinary people. In part, it reflected their view of the world. Life was filled with difficulties. Plagues, wars, unpredictable gods, political turbulence, economic struggles, and relatives who offered unsolicited advice. For many Greeks, the idea of simply resting, quietly, eternally, was profoundly appealing. Hades was not punishment. It was respite. As the soul moved further inward, the landscape broadened. The gates faded behind. The pathways opened into wider plains. A soft wind moved through the dim air, carrying no scent and no sound beyond the faint whisper of eternity. Hermes remained for a moment longer, ensuring the soul had found its place. Sometimes he lingered, sometimes he departed quickly, but always he fulfilled his duty with care. Ahead, the soul sensed its destination, the meadow, the judges, or perhaps something rarer and more luminous. But that part of the story belongs to what comes next. For now, the gates of Hades have opened, and eternity has revealed its first quiet breath. The soul's first real moment of orientation inside Hades came not from wandering the dim, echoing plains, nor from gazing upon the silent rivers, but from standing before the three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They were not perched upon towering thrones, or surrounded by flaming pillars, or accompanied by ominous music. The Greeks did not imagine their afterlife like that. Judgment, to them, was not theatrical. It was orderly, calm, and almost administrative. A kind of cosmic filing system, if you will, overseen by three figures chosen not for intimidation but for wisdom. The hall where the judges convened was imagined as vast but unadorned. No banners, no sculptures, no carved threats of divine punishment. The Greeks had neither the need nor the desire to decorate justice. The space itself was solemn, lit by a soft, ambient glow that came from nowhere in particular. It was less a courtroom and more a crossroads, a place where the soul's past gently intersected with its eternity. Rhadamanthus was often the first of the judges a soul might meet. In myths, he was known for his strictness, but also for an unwavering sense of fairness. He had been a mortal king once, a man admired for his impeccable judgment. Zeus, impressed with his reliability, appointed him as one of the judges of the dead. Rhadamanthus specialized in straightforward cases, the people whose lives were neither tangled with extreme heroism nor burdened with complicated wrongdoing. He listened, assessed, and made his decisions with the efficiency of someone who had long ago streamlined his process. Aeacus handled a different set of responsibilities. Known for his piety during life and for being a just ruler, he became the judge for souls from his region, or, depending on the tradition, the judge responsible for the keys of Hades. Aeacus, in art and poetry, often appears thoughtful, almost gentle. The Greeks believed that righteous rulers became righteous judges, and Aeacus embodied this beautifully. His decisions were neither hurried nor heavy-handed. He simply saw what was true and acted accordingly. But it was Minos who served as the final arbiter, the one who resolved the complex cases and rendered the ultimate judgment when debates arose. Minos, the legendary king of Crete, was famed for receiving divine laws directly from Zeus, which made him an expert in cosmic legality. The Greeks trusted him as the sort of person who could look through a soul, the way one might look through clear water, and understand its essence without confusion or prejudice. This ability made him the presiding judge, the quiet authority who ensured that every soul found its rightful place. Standing before these three figures, the soul did not tremble with fear. The Greeks did not imagine judgment as a moment of terror. Rather, it was a moment of truth, gentle, inevitable truth. One did not argue before the judges. One simply revealed oneself. The gods understood that the weight of a life could not be measured in speeches, excuses, or dramatic displays. A soul's true nature spoke more clearly than words. It is worth noting that the Greeks did not believe ordinary people were condemned to any terrible fate. Hades was not designed as a universal punishment. The vast majority of souls were destined for the asphodel meadows, the quiet, dreamlike plain where they would spend eternity in gentle wandering. Judgment was not about assigning torment. It was about determining which eternity best suited a soul's nature. Only a tiny handful of souls, those profoundly wicked or mythologically unfortunate, were sent to Tartarus. Those stories, involving the likes of Tantalus and Sisyphus, served more as moral fables than descriptions of everyday afterlife experience. The average Greek farmer, potter, sailor, or shepherd knew that his soul would not be rolling boulders for eternity. The Greeks found comfort in this. Life was hard enough. The afterlife, at least, need not be miserable. When the soul finally stood before the judges, it experienced something the Greeks imagined not as a confrontation, but as a kind of unburdening. The weight of choices, actions, intentions, and regrets, all the tangled threads of a lifetime, fell into clarity. There was no hiding, but there was also no harshness. The judges did not scold, shame, or condemn. They simply saw, and their vision was perfect. In some versions of the myth, the souls themselves recounted their deeds, offering a clear and honest reflection of their lives. But in most accounts, the judges needed no testimony. A soul's nature radiated visibly in the underworld. The judges were not fact-finding investigators. They were interpreters of truth. One of the most interesting details about the Greek concept of judgment is that it was not hierarchical. The three judges worked together, but each had his domain and his strengths. Rhadamanthus, practical and methodical. Aeacus, gentle and steadfast. Minos, wise and authoritative. The Greeks believed that fairness emerged from collaboration, a surprisingly democratic idea for a civilization not always known for universal justice in the mortal world. The process itself was imagined as brief. Eternity awaited. There was no reason to spend endless time in deliberation. Judgment was efficient, because truth was simple. Once the decision was made, the soul knew its path. Hermes often returned at this point, not as the primary guide, but as a companion, ready to walk with the soul toward its eternal destination. The underworld was vast, and while the judges assigned the path, Hermes ensured that no one wandered off into the wrong meadow or accidentally approached a river they had no business visiting. The Greeks also loved the idea that great heroes received special consideration. Achilles, for instance, might have been placed differently than a fisherman from Corinth. Poets enjoyed exploring these exceptions, not to imply a cosmic hierarchy of worth, but because heroes were narrative treasures. If everyone's afterlife were perfectly ordinary, stories would grow terribly dull, and the Greeks would never allow myth to become dull. It is also worth noting that the judges themselves were not gods in the usual sense. They did not receive widespread worship. They did not demand offerings. Their authority was respected, not feared. This made them distinct from most divine figures in Greek religion. They were entrusted with a task, and they performed it with timeless dedication. Mortals rarely prayed to them, because judgment in the afterlife was not something one could negotiate. Offerings could persuade Poseidon to calm a storm, or Athena to grant wisdom, but no sacrifice could alter the truth of a soul. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus represented one of the most profound Greek beliefs, that justice existed beyond life, not as punishment, but as order. The cosmos was not chaotic. It had a structure, and that structure extended into death. For many Greeks, especially in later philosophical periods, this was immensely comforting. Death did not erase meaning, it clarified it. And so, after receiving judgment, the soul did not feel shock or protest. Instead, it felt understanding, a gentle recognition of where it belonged. The three judges didn't point or command. They simply indicated the direction, with the certainty of those who had never once been mistaken. The soul turned to follow that path, and Hermes, appearing once more beside it, began to walk. The underworld opened before them, not frightening, not confining, but vast and quiet. The asphodel meadows awaited most souls, a peaceful, neutral eternity, where wandering felt like drifting through a dream. Others, rare and fortunate, journeyed onward to Elysium, a brighter, gentler realm. And an incredibly small few went elsewhere, to deeper places reserved for stories more dramatic than ordinary life. But all of that comes after judgment. For now, the soul has stood before the three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, and found its place in the enduring, orderly vastness of the Greek afterlife. For most souls, after judgment was complete and Hermes had resumed his quiet companionship, the journey led not to Elysium or Tartarus, but to a place far softer and far more familiar, the Asphodel Meadows. This was the destination of the vast majority of human beings: farmers, potters, shepherds, weavers, sailors, merchants, mothers, fathers, wanderers, warriors whose names were never written in epics, and children who grew into adults without ever wielding a sword or speaking with a god. The meadows were not glamorous and not terrible. They were gentle. And for many Greeks, that gentleness was precisely the point. The asphodel meadows appeared in myths and poetry as a vast, quiet plain covered in pale, ghostly flowers. The asphodel itself was a real plant, known throughout the Mediterranean. Its pale blooms grew in poor soil and were considered hardy, humble, and persistent, qualities that made it a fitting symbol for the afterlife of ordinary people. The meadows were imagined as a landscape washed in soft greys and silvers, neither bright nor dark, lit by a muted glow that came from no sun, no moon, and certainly no fire. It was an eternity without harshness. To a modern reader, this might sound a little uneventful, but the Greeks, who lived in a world filled with war, disease, unpredictable weather, and the occasional outbreak of divine mischief, valued calmness in a way that is sometimes hard to appreciate. If life was exhausting, eternity did not need to be. The meadows offered peace, not thrills. And for most people, peace was exactly what they had earned. When a soul entered the asphodel fields, it did not do so with fanfare. No trumpets sounded. No celestial banners unfurled. The underworld didn't believe in ceremonial red carpets. Instead, the soul simply stepped into the soft plain, felt the stillness settle around it, and understood that it had arrived where it would remain. The air held a faint fragrance. Nothing overpowering, just a suggestion of flowers on a cool morning. The ground was neither hard nor soft, but something in between, like walking on the threshold between dream and memory. The souls who wandered here were not unhappy, nor were they ecstatic. They existed in a state of gentle neutrality, free from earthly pain, earthly joy, and earthly ambitions. Their worries and triumphs, regrets and achievements had softened, paling like old ink, but their essence remained. The Greeks did not imagine souls as empty shells, drifting meaningless through eternity. Rather, they were simplified versions of their former selves, content to wander, to remember faintly, to exist without struggle. Homer describes the ordinary dead as shades, psyches, who retain their shape but not their strength. They were recognizable but softened, like seeing someone through a veil. When Odysseus visits the underworld, the souls of the dead flock to him, eager for the warmth of life he still carries. But they are not tormented. They are simply curious, stirred briefly out of their gentle drifting. This concept puzzled many later cultures who encountered Greek mythology. Why, they asked, was the afterlife not a reward or punishment for deeds done in life? Why was it so calm. But for the Greeks, whose religion was not built upon strict moral dichotomies, the idea of neutrality made perfect sense. The gods were not moral accountants tallying up points. They were beings of order, chaos, nature, and narrative. The afterlife did not need to be a grand cosmic sorting mechanism. It simply needed to be a place where souls went when their earthly story ended. Some philosophers, particularly the Orphics and later Platonists, felt the meadows were too dull and imagined something richer, a cycle of reincarnation, purification, or spiritual progression. But ordinary Greeks, tending their fields or mending their nets, probably found the idea of eternal rest quite appealing. After all, if your day-to-day life involved hauling amphorae, battling storms at sea, or negotiating with neighbours who believed their goats held divine opinions, a meadow of eternal calm must have seemed wonderfully soothing. One of the loveliest features of the meadows was companionship. The Greeks believed that souls recognised one another, though faintly. Reunion was not dramatic. It did not involve running into embraces or shouting across fields. But there was a sense of quiet familiarity. Friends found one another by drifting toward a feeling of recognition. Families remained connected, not by conversation or shared activities, but by being gently aware of each other's presence. It was a kind of eternal coexistence without the noise of mortal life. Hermes, after guiding the soul to the entrance of the meadows, didn't linger long. His task was complete, but he often gave a last nod, a small gesture that conveyed something like farewell. Then he turned back toward the gates, where other souls awaited his guidance. Hermes did not interfere with the life, or rather the unlife, of the souls within the meadows. The underworld had its own rhythms, and he honoured them. Within the meadows, time was a curious thing. It existed, and yet it didn't. Souls wandered not in circles or lines, but in soft patterns shaped by thought rather than footsteps. There was no hunger, no exhaustion, no need for shelter or warmth. Dreams and memories flowed gently through the fields. Some souls relived moments of their lives in quiet contemplation, walking with a faint echo of a loved one, recalling a childhood morning in a sunlit courtyard, or remembering the smell of bread from an oven that no longer existed. These memories did not evoke sorrow. They were softened by the new realm, like recollections that had aged into something tender. The asphodel meadows were not meant to be paradise. That belonged to Elysium. But they were far from bleak. They were the eternal middle ground, the resting place for those who had lived neither extraordinarily nor terribly. For the Greeks, this was perfectly natural. Most people lived ordinary lives. It was fitting that their eternity reflected that simplicity. Interestingly, the Greeks believed that even great heroes who were not granted access to Elysium might end up here, their glory dimmed, their epics reduced to whispers. Achilles' famous lament in the Odyssey, that he would rather be a living servant than a ruler among the dead, captures this sentiment. Glory, the Greeks knew, was fragile. In the meadows, it softened into humility. But not all tales of asphodel are melancholic. In some later versions of Greek belief, the meadows served as a kind of waiting area for reincarnating souls. Here, they rested until it was time to return to the world above, refreshed but forgetful. Plato's myth of Er describes souls gathering in a meadow before choosing new lives. This added a new layer of meaning, eternity as both end and beginning. Still, in the oldest stories, the meadows were the final home of most souls. Their simplicity was their strength, a realm without turmoil, a realm without ambition, a realm where existence continued gently, unshaken by the chaos of mortal life. There were no shadows of punishment here, no fires, no torture, no pits. The Greeks reserved such dramatic fates for only the most egregious offenders, almost all of them characters in myths, rather than people who ever lived. To the average Greek, the afterlife was not something to dread, but something to accept with quiet resignation, and perhaps even a touch of relief. And so the soul wandered, surrounded by countless others yet never crowded. The flowers rustled softly without wind. The landscape stretched endlessly, but it never felt empty. Time drifted without weight, and the soul, no longer burdened by fear, ambition, or grief, simply existed. This was the Asphodel Meadows. Not a punishment, not a reward. A resting place for the vast majority of humanity, a gentle eternity. For a very small number of souls, so small in fact, that the vast expanse of the Asphodel Meadows never felt their absence, the path after judgment did not lead into the grey, drifting calm of ordinary eternity. Instead, Hermes guided these rare travellers towards something gentler, brighter, and far more exceptional, Elysium. To the Greeks, this realm was not simply a reward, it was a recognition. A nod from the universe that certain lives had carried a particular brilliance, a touch of divine favour, or a heroic spirit that set them apart. The idea of Elysium evolved over centuries, but its essence remained consistent. It was the paradise of the Greek afterlife, a place not of stillness, like the meadows, but of ease. A realm where the great, the noble, the righteous, and sometimes the simply well-connected enjoyed an eternity free from toil. It wasn't about moral perfection. The Greeks were far too practical to expect anyone, even heroes, to be paragons of virtue. Instead, Elysium celebrated excellence, courage, honour, and occasionally the fortunate accidents of lineage. In its earliest descriptions, Elysium lay somewhere on the western edge of the world, far beyond the horizon, where the sun dipped below the sea each evening. Hesiod called it the Isles of the Blessed, a place where soft breezes blew perpetually from the ocean, and golden flowers bloomed across gentle fields. The inhabitants of Elysium did not work. They did not grow old. They lived in a perpetual spring, enjoying music, feasts, and the kind of leisure usually reserved for those who have completed every possible task on earth and earned a very long rest. One should not imagine the Greek paradise as overly extravagant. There were no jewelled palaces, no shining monuments, no elaborate displays of divine wealth. The Greeks valued harmony and proportion. Their paradise reflected beauty in moderation, the kind that feels soothing rather than overwhelming. Elysium's pleasures were simple but perfect. Warm sunlight that never burned, breezes that cooled without chilling, feasts where the wine was always perfectly mixed, and conversation that never drifted into arguments about politics or in-laws. The earliest heroes to reach Elysium were those who had direct connections to the gods. Cadmus and Harmonia were said to dwell there, restored to youth after a life filled with trials. Menelaus, husband of Helen, was promised a place among the Blessed Isles, not because of moral perfection. His life, after all, included a 10-year war, but because Zeus was technically his father-in-law. Connections mattered in Greek mythology. Even eternity could be influenced by family ties. Later poets expanded Elysium into a realm of merit, not just divine favour. They imagined that brave warriors, wise rulers, and those who had lived with particular nobility might earn a place there. These souls continued the activities they had loved in life, singing, training, discussing philosophy, or simply enjoying the company of others who understood glory. It was, in its way, a kind of eternal symposium, minus the drunkenness and heated debates about which city had the best olive oil. Unlike the Asphodel Meadows, which felt muted and weightless, Elysium was alive with colour. Grass grew green and soft. Flowers bloomed in vibrant clusters, and trees bore fruit without effort. The air carried a warmth reminiscent of an early summer morning. No shadows lingered. No mist clung to the ground. Everything felt clear, fragrant, and slightly enchanted, as though nature itself had taken a deep breath and decided to remain in that perfect state forever. Hermes did not always accompany souls into Elysium. His task generally ended at the border, where other divine beings received the newly blessed. In some traditions, Rhadamanthus himself, after his duties as judge, governed the realm, offering guidance and ensuring order. In others, the heroes simply lived freely, answering to no authority except the natural harmony of the place. The Greeks, practical people that they were, never attempted to micromanage their paradise. One of the more charming details about Elysium is the presence of music. Many ancient sources describe the songs of the Muses drifting across the fields, or the lyre of Orpheus filling the air with melodies so beautiful that even the flowers leaned closer to listen. Music represented harmony and divine inspiration, and there was no better symbol of a perfect afterlife. One imagines evenings filled with soft melodies, gentle laughter, and conversations that wrapped around the timeless air like warm cloth. But Elysium also evolved with Greek thought. In the time of Pindar and later philosophers, Elysium became not just a single paradise, but part of a cycle. Souls who lived 3 righteous lives might eventually earn a place in the Isles of the Blessed, a kind of spiritual graduation. This created a rare form of moral progression, though the Greeks still avoided painting the afterlife as an elaborate reward system. They preferred the image of an elite realm earned through extraordinary excellence rather than universal moral accounting. Then comes the famous dual image of the Isles, sometimes described as one island, sometimes several. Homer imagined a single land, while Hesiod described multiple isles scattered across the Western Sea. This variation speaks to the nature of Greek myth itself. Fluid, adaptive, comfortable with multiple interpretations coexisting peacefully. For the Greeks, the truth of Elysium was not in its geographical precision, but in its emotional resonance. It was the place where the best of humanity continued to be the best, free from the limitations of mortal existence. In some stories, Elysium even connected to the cycles of reincarnation, bridging paradise with philosophical development. Plato's account presents souls resting in a meadow before choosing new lives, some more wisely than others. The idea that souls might progress through multiple lives, ultimately reaching a blessed realm, gave the Greeks a sense of cosmic growth. Life was not a single opportunity, but part of a broader spiritual journey. Still, the common Greek listener, sitting beside a hearth or attending a festival, probably imagined Elysium in simpler terms. A quiet paradise for heroes and the especially fortunate. They might picture Achilles training with other warriors, or Orpheus performing gentle songs, or Helen walking among gardens with her beauty restored. Not dazzling or overwhelming, but serene. A poetic continuation of the finest qualities of human existence. Interestingly, Elysium was not imagined as a place of isolation. Companionship was central to its charm. Heroes dined together. Friends reunited. Lovers found one another again without the jealous interventions of gods. In a world where noble deeds often resulted in tragedy, Elysium restored what life took away. It allowed heroes to rest, not as symbols but as people. And yet, despite its wonders, Elysium remained exclusive. The Greeks knew it was not a universal destination. Ordinary souls did not expect it. No one told their children, "Be good, or you won't get to Elysium." Morality, for the Greeks, was not a currency to buy paradise. Instead, Elysium represented the rarest moments of human brilliance, the kind that shaped the world, inspired stories, and echoed across generations. One might imagine the soul, newly arrived at the gates of Elysium, stepping through a soft arch of trees and feeling sunlight, real sunlight, warm its shoulders for the first time since leaving the world above. The breeze carries hints of honey and thyme. In the distance, laughter drifts across the fields. Not loud, not boisterous, but peaceful. Someone plays a lyre. Someone else recites poetry. The soul breathes, and for the first time since dying, feels something like joy. Every paradise reflects the desires of those who imagine it. The Greeks imagined a place not of gold, but of harmony. Not of perfection, but of balance. Not of divine authority, but of human excellence raised gently to the level of eternity. And so the rare souls who arrived here remained, not wandering like the shades of Asphodel, not suffering like the condemned of Tartarus, but living in a timeless moment of peace, beauty, and honour. The Greeks called it Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, the Western Paradise. But perhaps the simplest name captures it best, the place where the best of humanity finally rests. For all the tranquility that characterized most of the Greek afterlife, there remained one region whispered about with caution, described with restraint, and visited only by the most unfortunate figures in mythology, Tartarus. If Elysium was the gentle paradise of the blessed, and the Asphodel meadows the soft rest of ordinary souls, Tartarus was something altogether different, a place so deep and distant that even the gods rarely spoke of it. Yet the Greeks never imagined it as hellish in the fire and brimstone sense later cultures developed. Instead, Tartarus was a realm of profound separation, a cosmic oubliette, a boundary rather than a torment chamber. From the outside, or from as close as anyone would want to get, it was described as lying far beneath Hades, so far below the earth that it was as distant from the underworld as the earth was from the sky. This immense distance mattered more than any physical description. It conveyed the idea that Tartarus was not simply the bad part of the afterlife, but a place entirely apart, inaccessible and unseen. Even the shadows of Hades did not reach it. The Greeks envisioned Tartarus as ancient, older than the Titans, older than Zeus, possibly older than the earth itself. When chaos first brought forth Gaia and the dark realm of Erebos, Tartarus appeared as well, not as an afterthought, but as one of the fundamental features of existence. It was less a prison and more a natural counterweight in the cosmos, like the deep trenches of the sea or the voids between stars. A place the universe needed, but preferred not to examine too closely. Only a handful of beings were ever sent there, and they were, without exception, individuals whose stories had already reached mythological extremes. The Titans, Cronus, Iapetus, Hyperion, and their colossal siblings, were imprisoned in Tartarus after losing the great war against the Olympians. But even they were not described as endlessly tortured. They were simply confined, kept far from the world above, so the new cosmic order could flourish without challenge. Their imprisonment resembled exile more than punishment, an eternal reminder of the old world fading beneath the new. Other figures sent to Tartarus suffered fates more symbolic than literal. Tantalus, who offended the gods through a mixture of arrogance and poor culinary judgment, endured perpetual hunger and thirst while standing in a pool whose water receded whenever he stooped to drink, and beneath fruit that retreated when he reached for it. His torment was paired with irony, a favourite Greek seasoning in myth. Sisyphus, the master trickster, pushed his boulder endlessly, not because the gods craved inventive torture techniques, but because his punishment reflected the futility and audacity of trying to outsmart death itself, there was also Ixion, bound to a whirling fiery wheel, and the Danaïdes, condemned to fill a leaky vessel for eternity. Yet even these stories were told sparingly, with more moral weight than gruesome detail. The Greeks were not morbid. They preferred to teach through metaphor rather than shock. Tartarus did not require elaborate horrors to make its point. Its isolation was punishment enough. The geography of Tartarus, insofar as Greek poets attempted to describe it, was less a place one could map and more a conceptual distance. Homer and Hesiod tell us that if a man were dropped into Tartarus, he would fall for 9 days before reaching the bottom, a poetic measurement rather than a literal one. The point was simple. Tartarus lay impossibly far from the world of the living. To be sent there was to be removed from the story entirely. Hermes did not guide souls to Tartarus. Charon did not ferry them. The ordinary machinery of the afterlife simply did not apply. Tartarus belonged to a different class of narrative, reserved for those whose myths required a dramatic and permanent conclusion. For everyone else, nearly every mortal ever born, it held no relevance. A farmer in Boeotia, a fisherman from Chios, or a merchant in Corinth never worried about ending up in Tartarus. It was not a moral threat used to keep mortals in line. It was a mythological backdrop used to reinforce cosmic hierarchy. To the Greeks, the universe operated on balance, reciprocity, and the maintenance of proper order. Tartarus existed to contain those who disrupted that order catastrophically. But even then, Greek poets rarely indulged in torment for torment's sake. Their gods did not oversee endless torture chambers. They upheld stability. Tartarus was an extension of that stability, a place where disruptive beings could no longer interfere with the functioning of life, death, or the rhythms of the natural world. In later philosophical traditions, Tartarus gained more explicit moral connotations. Plato, in particular, used the idea to describe the consequences of profound injustice. In his vision, souls guilty of extreme wrongdoing faced corrective punishment before being reincarnated. But even then, the emphasis was on restoration rather than sadism. Tartarus became part of a moral cycle, not a final destination for the majority of souls. Nevertheless, the earliest and most enduring Greek conception paints Tartarus as something quiet, deep, remote. If one were to imagine it through a gentle bedtime lens, which admittedly is not how the ancient Greeks would have put it, it is less a chamber of horrors and more like the farthest room in a house, long forgotten and seldom entered. A place that exists because stories require consequences, not because the cosmos delights in cruelty. One of the most striking things about Tartarus is that, despite its fearsome reputation, it rarely appears directly in Greek myths. Heroes do not journey there. Gods do not visit on a whim. Poets mention it in passing, almost reluctantly, as though saying its name too loudly might draw unwanted attention. Even when Odysseus descends to speak with the dead, he does not venture anywhere near Tartarus. The underworld he visits is broad and shadowed, but the realm of deepest punishment lies far below, unreachable. This distancing did something clever for Greek storytelling. It preserved mystery. Tartarus remained undefined, bound by more silence than detail. It allowed listeners to imagine it as vast or enclosed, hot or cold, structured or chaotic. It was a story space, a conceptual room in the mythic house where the lights were always off. And because the Greeks valued moderation in imagination as well as in life, they didn't embellish it needlessly. The souls sent there, almost always mythological figures rather than real or relatable individuals, became symbols of excess. their punishments warned listeners against hubris, betrayal, or offence against the gods. And yet, these punishments were poetic rather than grotesque. Sisyphus's endless labour spoke to the futility of defying divine order. Tantalus's unreachable feast highlighted the consequences of abusing hospitality. Ixion's spinning wheel reflected the uncontrollable nature of corrupted desire. Each story carried a moral shape, not a moral threat. To the ordinary soul resting peacefully in the asphodel meadows or wandering the soft fields of Elysium, Tartarus was as distant as the farthest star. It served the mythological world without touching the lives, or afterlives, of everyday people. And so, when one imagines the underworld as a whole, Tartarus sits not as a place of terror, but as a quiet, conceptually necessary chamber far below the rest. A reminder, tucked deep within the structure of the cosmos, that even in a universe governed by capricious gods and unpredictable fate, there are limits, there are consequences. But those consequences rarely concern mortals. For most people, then and now, the Greek afterlife is a gentle progression. Hermes' guidance, the rivers, the ferrymen, the judges, and then rest. The extreme cases, the dramatic punishments, belong to the great myths, not the great masses. And as this journey through the ancient Greek afterlife draws to a close, one is left with a surprisingly soft picture. The Greeks did not imagine death with fear so much as with curiosity. They pictured a world that reflected life, not in its chaos, but in its stillness. A realm where order prevailed, where souls found their place, and where eternity unfolded in quiet rhythms. Tartarus, in its deep remoteness, completes that picture, not by dominating it, but by reminding us that even the darkest part of the afterlife was shaped by the same principle as the gentlest, balance. Imagine, if you will, the vastness of ancient Greek thought. To them, the world was not a tiny globe we see in modern textbooks, spinning politely in space. It was a layered cosmos, the shining sky of Olympus, the shifting seas that surrounded the lands of men, and, deep below, the dark and mysterious underworld. And presiding over that realm, a figure who has been both feared and misunderstood, Hades. Hades was no villain, though centuries of mistranslation and creative license have painted him in a rather grim shade. In fact, to the Greeks, he was more bureaucrat than bogeyman. A god whose task was not to torment the dead, but to ensure that the natural order of life and death remained intact. If Zeus was the thunderous king, Poseidon the tempestuous sea lord, then Hades was the quiet accountant of eternity. Not glamorous, certainly, but dependable, and, one might argue, indispensable. To understand Hades, we must first return to the earliest tales, when the Titans still ruled. Hades was one of 6 children born to Cronus and Rhea: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and the youngest Zeus. The family dynamic was, how shall we put it, complicated. Cronus, having himself overthrown his father Uranus, had been warned by prophecy that his own children would one day do the same to him. And so, like any paranoid parent, he decided the best way to avoid this fate was simply to swallow his offspring whole. Yes, a rather unusual parenting strategy. Instead of lullabies and bedtime stories, Cronus's children were tucked away into his stomach, which, we can only imagine, was not the most comfortable of nurseries. There they remained, trapped in darkness, until the cunning of Rhea and the determination of Zeus set them free. Hades, therefore, entered the world already acquainted with confinement and shadow. One might say it prepared him rather well for his eventual station beneath the earth. When Zeus matured, he tricked Cronus into disgorging his siblings, Hades among them. Together, they rose against the Titans in the great war known as the Titanomachy. This was not a minor skirmish, but a cosmic upheaval lasting 10 years, with mountains hurled like spears and thunder shaking the firmament. In this war, Hades proved himself a formidable ally. Armed with a helm of invisibility crafted by the Cyclopes, he could slip unseen past even the mightiest of foes. Stealth was his advantage, and in the decisive battle, it allowed him to strike fear and confusion into the Titans' ranks. At last, the Titans were defeated, bound, and cast into Tartarus. The three victorious brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, then drew lots to divide the cosmos. Zeus claimed the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades drew the short straw, or so it seemed, and inherited the underworld. Some tellings paint this as unfortunate luck, as though Hades had lost a game of divine dice. But in truth, the underworld was not a punishment. It was simply a share of existence, as vital as sea or sky. After all, death is the one certainty in life, and to rule over it is no small responsibility. It is here that Hades begins to diverge from his brothers in reputation. Zeus, ever dramatic, filled the myths with thunderbolts, seductions, and arguments. Poseidon, tempestuous, shook the earth with quakes and floods. Hades, however, lingered in the background. Few stories feature him as an active character, and when they do, he is often portrayed as stern, inevitable, and somewhat aloof. This aloofness has often been misinterpreted. The Greeks themselves did not equate Hades with evil. He was not the devil, for the Greeks had no devil. He was not a tormentor. Indeed, the punishments of the wicked were left to other figures, such as the Erinyes, or to the natural mechanics of Tartarus itself. Hades' task was governance, not cruelty. Still, his realm carried a chill. The Greeks rarely spoke his name directly, preferring euphemisms such as Pluton, the wealth bringer, acknowledging that the riches of the earth, metals, and fertile soil all lay beneath. Speaking his true name was thought to attract unwanted attention, rather like whistling in the dark and hoping nothing answers back. If we step from myth into history, the fear of Hades mirrors Greek funerary practices. The Greeks were a people who believed strongly in proper burial. To be left unburied was a horror, for it condemned the soul to wander endlessly. This is why the Iliad makes such ceremony of funeral pyres, and why Antigone's defiance, insisting her brother must be buried despite the king's decree, was such a powerful tale. Burial rites were not merely cultural, they were religious, designed to appease Hades and ensure safe passage into his realm. Coins were often placed in the mouths or upon the eyes of the dead, a fee for Charon, the ferryman who guided souls across the river. One might think of it as the original toll road. Without payment, the spirit was said to linger restlessly on the near shore. It is not difficult to imagine how these beliefs structured daily life. Death, after all, was not an abstraction in the ancient world. Plagues, wars, and accidents were ever present. To have a god who governed that certainty gave it shape, a form, and perhaps even a kind of comfort. Greek poets were often reluctant to linger on Hades' character, preferring to describe his realm. Homer, in the Odyssey, speaks of the underworld as a place of shadow, where even great heroes appear as pale phantoms. When Odysseus journeys there, it is with dread, and the audience would have shared that dread, for the land of Hades was the great unknown. Yet some texts reveal hints of fairness in Hades' rule. He is not depicted as arbitrary or capricious. Indeed, he is less quarrelsome than Zeus, less rash than Poseidon, and far less cruel than many other deities. But he is relentless. And perhaps that relentlessness is what mortals feared most. One cannot bargain with Hades. One cannot escape him. One might wonder, did the Greeks ever laugh at death? Surprisingly, yes. Ancient comedies often poked fun at the underworld, depicting Hades as a somewhat stiff character, the butt of jokes about his gloomy nature. In Aristophanes' Frogs, for example, the realm of Hades becomes the backdrop for satire and slapstick. Imagine, if you will, the god of the dead trying to maintain solemn dignity while actors cavort about, making ribald jokes about corpses. This juxtaposition reflects something universal in humanity, our tendency to soften fear with humour. Much as today we make light of grim topics in nervous laughter, so too did the Greeks. And perhaps Hades himself, though never portrayed as jovial, might have tolerated it. After all, every joke about him was a reminder of his inevitability. To the Greeks, Hades was not merely a dark figure lurking beneath. He was the shadow that gave definition to light, the certainty that underpinned mortal life. Without death, there could be no urgency to live. Without the underworld, no meaning to the world above. He was, in short, not a god of malice, but of balance. A king who did not seek worshippers, who did not storm about Olympus demanding recognition, but who held a domain no one else could claim. And so, in hushed tones, his name was avoided, his presence acknowledged indirectly, and his realm feared but respected. He was the unseen constant of Greek life, the shadowed god whose authority no one, not even Zeus, could deny. As we leave this chapter, picture Hades not as a monster, but as a quiet sentinel. Imagine him seated on a throne of black stone, robed not in flame, but in solemn dignity, a crown of obsidian upon his head. Around him stretches his vast domain, not screaming with torment, but murmuring with the endless passage of souls, like the tide of a sea no mortal eye could ever behold. This is the Hades we begin with, a god of shadow, of inevitability, and of wealth hidden deep in the earth. Stern, silent, and in his own way fair. And in the chapters to come, we will walk deeper into his realm, past the gates, across the rivers, into the meadows, the palaces, the mysteries, and the myths that shaped how the Greeks saw both life and death. For now, let us leave the shadowed god in his throne of silence, waiting as he always does, with infinite patience. When the Greeks closed their eyes and thought of death, they did not picture an empty void, nor did they imagine fiery torment as later traditions would. Instead, they envisioned a realm beneath the earth, a place structured and ordered, where every soul had its place. This was the underworld, vast, shadowed, and unyielding. It bore the same name as its ruler, Hades, and though it inspired fear, it was not chaos. It was a kingdom, mapped out in rivers, plains, and palaces, a landscape that reflected the Greek belief that even death required structure. To enter this world was to begin a journey, one that nearly every person in Greece believed lay before them. That journey began the moment life slipped away. The soul, or psyche, was thought to leave the body in the form of a breath or a faint flutter, often imagined as a butterfly or bird-like shadow. Relatives hurried to tend the corpse, washing it carefully, clothing it in clean garments, and laying it out for the final rites. A coin was placed on the lips or over the eyes, a small but essential detail, for it was the fare for the ferrymen who waited below. Without this payment, the Greeks believed, the soul could not cross into the underworld, doomed instead to linger at the threshold, restless and unhappy. The soul's path led to the banks of the Acheron, the river of woe. There, a crowd of shades waited, pressing forward in silence, until the ferryman, Charon, arrived. He was no friendly guide, but a surly old boatman, weary from his endless task. He accepted only those who had been properly buried, and only those with the coin. His boat was a narrow, creaking vessel, gliding across the black current with deliberate strokes. The living feared him, and they feared the possibility that their loved ones might wander forever if the rites were neglected. To this day, archaeologists uncover coins placed in ancient graves, mute testimony to this belief. Once ferried across, the soul faced the gates of the underworld. They were high and forbidding, guarded by Cerberus, the hound with 3 heads. His jaws gnashed, his eyes gleamed, and his tail, often described as serpent-like, coiled restlessly. Yet his purpose was not cruelty. He did not devour the innocent. Rather, he was the keeper of boundaries, ensuring that no living intruder wandered in, and that no spirit slipped back to the realm of sunlight. It was a role mirrored across many cultures. Egypt had guardians at the gates of the Duat. Mesopotamia had its own monstrous sentinels. Cerberus was Greece's answer to the universal fear that death might be reversible, and that order required watchmen. Beyond those gates stretched the true heart of the underworld, divided into